The moment I saw my sister Victoria whispering to a stranger at my wedding rehearsal dinner while pointing at me, I knew she was about to destroy everything. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording her crimes for 6 months. My name is Esther Scottwell, and I'm 29 years old. What you're about to hear is how my own sister hired private investigators to destroy my wedding, tried to prove I was a thief and a liar, and ended up in FBI handcuffs instead. But let me start from the beginning because this twisted story begins with the death of the one person who truly saw Victoria for what she was. Before I continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Thank you. 8 months ago, my grandmother Rose passed away after a long battle with lung disease. I'd spent the last 2 years of her life as her primary caregiver, driving her to appointments, managing her medications, and spending countless nights by her bedside when she couldn't sleep. My older sister Victoria, 5 years my senior at 34, was always too busy with her important investment banking career to help. She'd show up once a month with flowers from the gas station and stay for exactly 45 minutes, usually on her phone the entire time. When the will was read, Victoria nearly had a stroke right there in the lawyer's office. Grandmother Rose had left me $150,000 and her collection of vintage jewelry, including the Art Deco engagement ring from 1932 that had been in our family for generations. Victoria received $50,000. That was it. The lawyer also mentioned that Grandma owned 40% of the family import business that Victoria had been managing, and those shares would remain in trust for now. Victoria's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, and through gritted teeth, she hissed that there must be some mistake. The lawyer calmly showed her grandma's video testimony, recorded just 3 months before her death, where she clearly stated her wishes and her reasons. In the video, Grandma looked directly at the camera and said that love is shown through actions, not words, and she wanted to reward the grandchild who had shown her true love. That should have been the end of it, but I knew my sister. Victoria had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She married James, a successful corporate lawyer, lived in a mini mansion in Westchester, and drove a Mercedes that cost more than most people's annual salary. The idea that the grandmother she'd ignored had chosen me, the public school teacher with the modest apartment and the Toyota Camry, was absolutely unacceptable to her. The strange incident started 3 weeks after the funeral. First, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that a nice young man had been asking about me, wanting to know if I'd recently come into money or made any large purchases. Then the mailman told me someone had been photographing my mail before I collected it. My landlord called to verify my employment because someone claiming to be from a credit agency had questions about my ability to pay rent. But the funniest part was Victoria suddenly developing an interest in being a loving sister. She'd show up at my apartment with store-bought cookies still in the plastic container, claiming she'd been baking all morning and just happened to have extras. She'd casually ask about my finances while pretending to admire my engagement ring from Marcus, my fiancé of 2 years. The woman who hadn't voluntarily spent time with me since high school was suddenly dropping by twice a week with terrible excuses. During one visit, she actually asked if I'd been feeling guilty about anything lately because I looked stressed. This from a woman who once told me that teaching was a job for people who couldn't succeed in the real world. I served her instant coffee in my cheapest mug and watched her pretend to enjoy it while fishing for information about Grandma's money. She kept mentioning how expensive weddings were these days, wondering aloud how Marcus and I could possibly afford the beautiful venue we'd chosen at the Riverside Garden Estate. The thing is, Marcus's family owned a construction business, and we'd been saving for our wedding for 3 years. We didn't need Grandma's money for the wedding, but Victoria couldn't fathom that 2 middle-class people could afford anything nice without stealing or lying. She sat there in her designer suit, with her Louis Vuitton purse taking up half my coffee table, suggesting that maybe I should have the will reviewed again to make sure everything was distributed fairly. I told her the only thing that needed reviewing was her definition of fair. 2 months before my wedding, things escalated dramatically. My friend Sarah, who worked at the local credit union, pulled me aside during lunch and whispered that someone had been trying to access information about my accounts. She couldn't give me details due to privacy laws, but she showed me security footage of a man in a cheap suit showing Victoria's photo on his phone to the bank manager. That's when I knew Victoria had hired private investigators. The next day, I installed a doorbell camera and started documenting everything. Within a week, I had footage of 3 different men photographing my apartment building, my car, and even following me to the grocery store. One of them was so obvious about it that the store security guard asked if I needed help. The investigator actually tried to pretend he was shopping for organic kale while standing in the cereal aisle. Victoria's manipulation of our father started around the same time. Dad had been neutral about the will, saying Grandma had the right to distribute her assets however she wanted. But suddenly, he started calling me with concerns. Did I pressure Grandma when she was weak? Was I sure the will was legitimate? Had I maybe influenced her when she wasn't thinking clearly? These weren't his words. I could practically hear Victoria's voice coming out of his mouth. Then the wedding sabotage began. First, our florist called to cancel, saying they'd received information that we were planning to skip out on the bill. When I pressed for details, they admitted someone claiming to be my concerned relative had warned them about us. Next, the caterer had a mysterious scheduling conflict that hadn't existed the week before. The venue received an anonymous complaint about potential noise violations and threatened to cancel our contract. That's when James, Victoria's husband, reached out to me. He asked to meet at a coffee shop downtown, looking over his shoulder like he was in a spy movie. The man was genuinely scared of his own wife. He slid a folder across the table and told me Victoria had hired not 1, not 2, but 3 different private investigation firms. She'd spent over $30,000 of their savings trying to prove I was a fraud. James showed me credit card statements, emails to the investigators, and even a spreadsheet where Victoria had been tracking my supposed lies. She'd created categories like financial deception, elder abuse evidence, and mental instability indicators. Under that last one, she'd written that I chose teaching as a career, which apparently indicated poor judgment. I couldn't help but laugh, which made James relax a little. He told me Victoria had been acting increasingly erratic, staying up all night researching inheritance law, convinced she could overturn the will if she could just prove I was unfit. She'd even consulted with 5 different lawyers, all of whom told her she had no case, but Victoria didn't accept defeat. She never had. In high school, when she lost the student council election, she tried to get the winner disqualified on a technicality about campaign posters. The worst part was the way she was poisoning the extended family against me. She told our aunts that I had isolated Grandma from the family during her illness. She told our cousins that I had stolen jewelry from Grandma's house before the will was read. She even told our great-uncle Harold that I was planning to sell Grandma's house and pocket the money, even though the house had been sold 2 years ago to pay for Grandma's medical care and Victoria had been the one managing that sale. But James revealed something even more shocking. He'd been tracking strange transactions in Victoria's business accounts, large sums of money moving to offshore accounts, invoices that didn't match shipments, contracts with companies that seemed to exist only on paper. He thought Victoria was embezzling from the family import business, the one where Grandma had been a silent partner. He'd been gathering evidence for divorce proceedings. But now he wondered if there was more to it. I started my own investigation that night. Marcus helped me go through public records, business filings, and financial documents that were available online. What we found made my stomach turn. Victoria had been siphoning money from the business for at least 2 years, right around the time Grandma got sick and stopped reviewing the monthly reports. Meanwhile, Victoria kept up her performance as the concerned sister. She'd call me crying, saying she just wanted to protect me from making mistakes with my inheritance. She brought wedding magazines from 2015 that she'd found in her garage, suggesting venues that had closed years ago. She even offered to help with the wedding planning, then recommended vendors who were either out of business or so expensive they were clearly meant to drain my savings. Her acting was so bad that Marcus started calling her performances Victoria's Community Theater Hour. The deeper I dug into Victoria's embezzlement, the clearer her desperation became. Using the login credentials Grandma had written in her address book, I accessed the business's cloud storage. 2 years of doctored invoices, fake vendor payments, and mysterious consulting fees all led to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Victoria had stolen over $500,000 while Grandma was dying. The pattern was clever but cruel. She'd started small, 10,000 here, 15,000 there, always during months when Grandma was hospitalized. She knew no one would be checking the books while we were all worried about Grandma's health. By the time Grandma passed, Victoria had created an entire phantom supply chain, complete with fake companies that existed only to funnel money offshore. I realized why Victoria needed to discredit me so badly. If I was proven to be a liar and a thief, no one would believe me if I discovered her embezzlement. She was creating a narrative where I was the dishonest sister who'd manipulated a dying woman. That way, if I ever found out about the missing money, she could claim I was just trying to deflect from my own crimes. Subscribe to my channel if you're enjoying this crazy story. And please hit that like button because your support helps me continue sharing these unbelievable family dramas. This story is about to get even wilder. The wedding planning continued despite Victoria's sabotage. Marcus's family stepped up in ways that made me cry with gratitude. His mother called her connections and found us a new florist. His father's construction crew offered to help decorate the venue. His grandmother, a feisty 80-year-old named Betty, called Victoria and told her that if she showed her face at the wedding wearing white, she'd personally escort her out. Betty had been married 4 times and claimed she knew how to spot a troublemaker from 50 yards away. But Victoria wasn't done. She started showing up at wedding vendor meetings, pretending to be helping while actually trying to gather intelligence for her big reveal. She'd corner the wedding planner and ask if we'd paid our deposits. She'd tell the photographer that there might be some family drama and to keep his camera ready. She even approached the priest and suggested he might want to emphasize the importance of honesty during the ceremony. I started recording everything. Every conversation with Victoria, every phone call, every interaction. Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state, but I made sure to tell her I was recording for wedding memories. She was so focused on her own scheme that she didn't realize she was creating evidence against herself. In one recording, she actually admitted to hiring the private investigators, claiming it was for my own good to make sure I wasn't being scammed. The real breakthrough came when I found emails between Victoria and someone named Robert Castellano, who turned out to be her partner in the embezzlement scheme. Robert had been creating the fake companies and managing the offshore accounts, but their partnership was falling apart. Robert wanted his cut of the money, and Victoria was stalling. She'd promised him $200,000, but had only paid him $50,000. His emails were getting increasingly threatening. James had been documenting everything on his end, too. He'd installed a recording app on his phone and captured Victoria practicing her wedding speech, where she planned to stand up and announce that she had proof I'd forged Grandma's signature on legal documents. She'd hired a handwriting expert who, for the right price, was willing to say anything. She practiced her dramatic reveal over and over, even timing how long it would take security to reach her if they tried to remove her from the venue. The funniest part was how bad Victoria's private investigators were. One got stuck in my apartment building's dumpster while trying to go through my trash. Another one approached my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, so many times that she started hitting him with her purse whenever she saw him. The third one tried to follow me to work but got lost because he was using an outdated GPS and ended up at an abandoned school 3 miles away. Meanwhile, I'd contacted a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes. When I showed him the evidence of embezzlement, his eyes went wide. This wasn't just theft, it was wire fraud, tax evasion, and customs violations, since the import business dealt with international shipments. He immediately contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who, as it turned out, had already been investigating the business for suspicious activity. The FBI agent assigned to the case, Special Agent Martinez, told me they'd been tracking unusual payment patterns for 6 months, but hadn't been able to identify the source. My evidence was exactly what they needed. They'd been watching Robert Castellano for other criminal activities, and Victoria had just made their job much easier. Agent Martinez asked if Victoria was planning any upcoming actions, and I told him about the wedding. His response was unexpected. He asked if we'd mind having some additional guests at our ceremony. 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat in a conference room with FBI agents, my lawyer, James, and Marcus, planning what Agent Martinez called Operation Wedding Bells. The plan was brilliantly simple. We would let Victoria execute her plan to expose me at the wedding while the FBI gathered the final evidence they needed for arrest. They wanted her to feel confident, even cocky, because desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes would strengthen their case. The agents would attend as guests, strategically placed throughout the venue. James would wear a wire to capture any last-minute admissions from Victoria. We'd have the wedding videographer live stream the ceremony, supposedly for relatives who couldn't attend, but really to create an indisputable record of Victoria's false accusations and the subsequent arrest. Victoria, meanwhile, was ramping up her campaign to destroy me. She created a 40-page document titled Evidence of Esther's Deception, complete with photoshopped bank statements, fabricated emails, and testimonies from her paid experts. She'd convinced our father that she was protecting the family from scandal. Dad, bless his confused heart, didn't understand why his daughters couldn't just get along but trusted Victoria because she showed him official-looking papers. The extended family was completely divided. Team Victoria included the relatives who'd always been impressed by her success and wealth. Team Esther consisted of the cousins who remembered how I'd helped them with homework, the aunts who appreciated my care for Grandma, and Uncle Harold, who never liked Victoria anyway because she'd once called his prized rose garden pedestrian. James was barely holding it together. He told me Victoria had started talking to divorce lawyers, not because she wanted to leave him, but to research how to hide assets in case her plan backfired. She didn't know he'd already filed for divorce and frozen their joint accounts. He'd also discovered she'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without telling him, using the money to fund her investigation into me and pay Robert Castellano. The humor in all this darkness came from unexpected places. Marcus's grandmother, Betty, appointed herself as my personal bodyguard, showing up at wedding preparations with a taser she'd bought online. She claimed she'd used it once on a masher in 1987 and was ready to use it again. The wedding planner, after learning about the situation, offered to seat Victoria directly in front of the chocolate fountain, just in case someone needed to accidentally bump into her. My teacher friends created Operation Bridesmaid Shield. They scheduled shifts to make sure I was never alone with Victoria, using code words like code algebra if Victoria approached. One of them, a former Marine turned kindergarten teacher, practiced tactical maneuvers for blocking Victoria's access to the microphone during the ceremony. 2 weeks before the wedding, Victoria made her final preparations. She sent formal letters to 50 family members, telling them to pay special attention during the ceremony because important information about the family's future would be revealed. She hired a process server to be ready with cease and desist orders for the inheritance. She even booked a conference room at a nearby hotel for what she called an emergency family meeting after the ceremony. But Victoria made crucial mistakes. In her arrogance, she sent Robert Castellano the final payment plan via email, detailing how she'd pay him after she regained control of Grandma's estate by proving I was unfit. She didn't realize the FBI was monitoring Robert's communications. She also transferred $50,000 from the business account to pay her handwriting expert, creating a clear trail of fraudulent activity. The week of the wedding, everything accelerated. Victoria called vendors pretending to be me, trying to cancel services. She told the venue there was a bomb threat, hoping to force a cancellation. She even contacted Marcus's employer, suggesting they should know their employee was marrying a criminal. Each action was more desperate than the last, and we documented everything. James gave me recordings of Victoria practicing her wedding speech in the mirror. She'd refined it to exactly 12 minutes, planning to start with tears about protecting the family, transition to disappointment about my betrayal, and conclude with the dramatic reveal of her evidence. She'd even choreographed when to pull out the folders, when to point at me, and when to demand the wedding be stopped. The FBI agents attended the rehearsal dinner, posing as Marcus's extended family from Ohio. Victoria was so focused on her plan that she didn't notice them photographing her meeting with the private investigators in the parking lot. She'd hired all three to attend the wedding as witnesses, promising them bonuses if their testimony was convincing enough. That night, unable to sleep, I found an old letter from Grandma in my jewelry box. She'd written it when I first started taking care of her. It said, "My dear Esther, your sister thinks success means taking everything you can. You know it means giving everything you have. That's why I trust you with my legacy. Don't let her bitterness poison your sweetness. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting karma handle the rest." I thought about that letter as I prepared for my wedding day, knowing it would be the most dramatic day of our family's history. Victoria thought she was the director of this show, but she was about to discover she'd cast herself as the villain in her own production. The morning of my wedding arrived with the kind of perfect sunny weather that Victoria would later claim I didn't deserve. I woke up at 5:30 in Marcus's childhood bedroom at his parents' house, tradition keeping us apart the night before. My phone already had 17 missed calls from Victoria, and one text that simply said, "Today, everyone will know the truth." I deleted it and went to make coffee. By 7, the bridal suite at the Riverside Garden Estate was buzzing with activity. My bridesmaids had established a security perimeter that would make the Secret Service proud. My maid of honor, Jessica, had actually printed out photos of Victoria and distributed them to the venue staff with instructions to alert her immediately if she tried to access restricted areas. Victoria arrived at 8:30, 2 hours before the ceremony, dragging 3 large boxes and wearing a cream-colored dress that she would spend the rest of the day insisting was champagne. The dress had so much tulle, it looked like she'd robbed a ballet company. Betty took one look at her and loudly asked if someone had ordered a backup wedding cake, because that's what Victoria resembled. The boxes Victoria brought contained copies of her evidence dossier, one for each family member. She'd spent thousands having them professionally bound with gold embossing that read, "The Truth About Esther Scotwell." Inside were the doctored bank statements, the paid expert testimonies, and photos the private investigators had taken of me doing suspicious things, like grocery shopping and going to work. The 3 private investigators arrived separately, trying to blend in as regular guests. The first one wore a suit that still had the rental tag sticking out. The second brought a date he'd clearly hired from an escort service who kept asking him what her motivation was supposed to be. The third tried to look casual but stood out because he was taking photos of everything, including the catering setup and the exit signs, like he was casing the joint. Victoria cornered our father in the garden before the ceremony, spreading her documents across a bench like she was presenting a court case. Dad, wearing the navy suit I'd bought him and looking deeply uncomfortable, kept glancing at me through the window as I got my hair done. I could see him trying to reconcile Victoria's evidence with the daughter he'd watched grow up. Agent Martinez and his team had arrived dressed as Marcus's extended family. They blended in perfectly, except for the fact that they were all mysteriously interested in staying near the exits and had earpieces they kept touching. One of them was posing as Marcus's cousin from Toledo and had to quickly Google facts about Ohio when Betty started quizzing him about local restaurants. The wedding planner, who'd been fully briefed on the situation, had strategically arranged the seating to put Victoria front and center, right where everyone could see her when she made her move. She'd also arranged for 2 security guards to be stationed near the altar, supposedly for the expensive flower arrangements, but really to intercept Victoria if needed. Meanwhile, James was in the groom's suite with Marcus, wearing not just a wire, but 3 different recording devices, because he wanted to make sure everything was captured. He looked pale and kept checking his phone for updates from his divorce lawyer. He'd already moved his important belongings to his brother's house and changed all his passwords. He told Marcus that after 13 years of marriage, he was finally going to see Victoria face consequences for her actions. At 9:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony, Victoria made her move to set the stage. She placed her evidence folders on specific chairs, targeting the family members she thought would be most influential. She cornered the photographer and told him to be ready for a major news event, even slipping him an extra $500 to make sure he captured everything. The humor of the morning came from the flower girl, my 5-year-old niece, Sophie, who'd been told by her other grandmother that Aunt Victoria was being naughty. Sophie took this very seriously and followed Victoria around saying things like, "Santa's watching you," and "Naughty people get coal, not cake." Victoria, trying to maintain her composure, kept shooing Sophie away, but the little girl was persistent. At one point, Sophie loudly announced that Victoria smelled like the mean lady at the bank, which made several guests laugh. My makeup artist, unaware of the drama, kept commenting on how calm I seemed for a bride. She said most women were nervous wrecks, but I seemed like I was preparing for something I'd been planning for years. She wasn't wrong. I'd been preparing for this confrontation with Victoria my whole life. Today just happened to be my wedding day, too. Victoria's final preparation was to gather her private investigators for a quick huddle by the fountain. I watched from the bridal suite window as she handed them scripts, actual typed scripts of what they should say when called upon. One of them was practicing his lines, moving his hands dramatically as he recited allegations about my suspicious financial activity. He looked like a community theater actor preparing for his big moment. As 10 o'clock approached and guests took their seats, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Half the family knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know what. The other half just thought Victoria had overdressed for the occasion. The FBI agents were in position, the cameras were rolling, and the live stream had started. Supposedly for Great Aunt Mildred in Florida, but really for the federal prosecutor's office. I stood at the mirror in my wedding dress, the same vintage lace dress Grandma had worn in 1953, which Victoria had always assumed she'd wear one day. Marcus knocked on the door, breaking tradition to see me before the ceremony. He took my hands and said, "Whatever happens out there, remember that by the end of this day, we'll be married, and Victoria will be exactly where she deserves to be." The wedding march began at exactly 10:05, and I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, feeling like I was walking into battle in a wedding dress. Victoria sat in the front row, her cream dress spread across 2 chairs, clutching her evidence folder like a weapon. Her eyes followed me with the intensity of a predator tracking prey. The ceremony began beautifully. Marcus's vows made me cry genuine tears, talking about how I'd shown him that real strength was kindness and real wealth was love. When it was my turn, I spoke about trust, honesty, and the family we choose versus the family we're born into, looking directly at Victoria as I said it. She shifted in her seat, checking her watch, waiting for her moment. Father Michael, who'd been briefed on the potential disruption, moved through the ceremony steadily. When he reached the pivotal moment, his voice carried across the garden. "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." Victoria stood up so fast her chair tipped backward with a crash. "I object!" she declared, her voice shaking with what she probably thought was righteous anger, but sounded more like desperation. "This wedding is built on lies and deception!" The crowd gasped. The photographer's camera clicked rapidly. Agent Martinez shifted slightly in his seat, his hand moving to his pocket. James hit record on his phone, even though he was already wired. Victoria opened her folder with a flourish, pulling out papers like she was revealing royal decrees. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, I come to you with a heavy heart, but a duty to the truth. My sister, Esther Scottwell, has perpetrated a massive fraud against our family." She held up the first document. "I have here proof that Esther manipulated our dying grandmother into changing her will. This handwriting analysis proves that signatures were forged." She waved the paper dramatically, not realizing the expert who'd provided it was about to lose his license for falsifying documents. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice gaining confidence, "private investigators have documented Esther's suspicious financial activities, including large cash deposits immediately after our grandmother's death. She claimed to be a simple teacher, but she's been living like someone with stolen money." At this point, I raised my hand calmly. "Victoria, those deposits were from selling my car and Marcus's bonus from work. We have all the documentation. But please continue. I'm sure everyone would love to hear more of your theories." This threw Victoria off her rhythm, but she pressed on. "You manipulated Grandma when she was weak. You isolated her from the family. You turned her against me. Her voice cracked on that last part, showing the real hurt beneath all her schemes. That's when I nodded to the wedding videographer who switched the display screens around the venue from romantic photos of Marcus and me to something very different. Suddenly, every screen showed bank records, wire transfers, and invoices from Victoria's embezzlement scheme. Actually, Victoria, I said, my voice carrying clearly thanks to the wireless microphone I wore, let's talk about the real fraud. $523,000 stolen from Grandma's business over 2 years. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Fake vendors named Castellano Consulting and VRS Imports. Victoria's face went from red to white to green like a confused traffic light. That's ridiculous. You're making this up. James stood up from the groomsmen section. Actually, Victoria, it's all true. I've been documenting everything for months. The FBI has been investigating for even longer. That's when Agent Martinez stood up, pulling out his badge. Mrs. Victoria Hartley, I'm Special Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit customs violations. Victoria tried to run, but in her enormous cream dress and 6-inch heels, she didn't get far. She tripped over her own train near the fountain, falling spectacularly into a display of lilies. As 2 agents helped her up and produced handcuffs, she screamed, "This is entrapment! Esther set me up! She's the criminal here!" The 3 private investigators tried to slowly back away, but Agent Martinez's team stopped them. One of them immediately started cooperating, admitting Victoria had paid him to fabricate evidence. The second claimed he thought this was all legitimate research. The third, the one with the obvious escort date, just kept muttering, "I'm keeping the retainer, right? The check cleared, right?" Victoria's arrest was being live-streamed to hundreds of distant relatives and friends who'd tuned in for a wedding but got a federal crime bust instead. My cousin in California later said it was better than any reality TV show she'd ever watched. Great Aunt Mildred in Florida apparently opened champagne and toasted the screen. As the FBI led Victoria away, she made one last desperate play. "Daddy, tell them. Tell them how Esther manipulated everyone. You know I'm the good daughter. I'm the successful one." Our father, who'd been frozen in shock, finally spoke. "Victoria, I just watched you try to destroy your sister's wedding with lies, while the FBI showed evidence of you stealing from your grandmother's business. The only person who manipulated anyone was you, the photographer, earning every penny of his fee plus Victoria's bribe, captured it all. The image that would later go viral showed Victoria in handcuffs, her cream dress covered in lily pollen, mascara streaming down her face, while in the background the wedding party stood in perfect formation, like nothing had happened. After the FBI vehicles left with Victoria, Father Michael cleared his throat and said, "Well, that was certainly a first for me. Shall we continue with the holy matrimony? Or does anyone else have any federal crimes to confess?" The tension broke with laughter. Marcus took my hand, whispered, "Your family is never boring," and we resumed the ceremony. When Father Michael pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was thunderous, not just for our marriage, but for the absolute karma we'd all just witnessed. The reception that followed was legendary. Everyone had a Victoria story to share, and the open bar helped loosen tongues. Our cousin Janet admitted Victoria had tried to recruit her to testify against me. Uncle Harold revealed Victoria had offered him $10,000 to say he'd seen me stealing from Grandma's house. Our Aunt Patricia said Victoria had called her 17 times, trying to convince her I was mentally unstable. The DJ, who'd been watching the whole arrest through the window, created a special playlist that included Jailhouse Rock, I Fought the Law, and Karma Police. When he played Truth Hurts by Lizzo, the entire wedding party formed a conga line. Betty led it, shouting, "This is better than my third wedding when my ex's mistress showed up." Dad found me during the father-daughter dance, tears in his eyes. He apologized for doubting me, for letting Victoria manipulate him. He told me he'd been so proud of Victoria's success that he'd ignored the warning signs, the way she'd treated Grandma, the way she'd always needed to be better than everyone else, the way she'd never been satisfied with what she had. He promised to get therapy to understand how he'd enabled her behavior for so long. James got drunk, really drunk, and gave an impromptu speech about the 13 years he'd wasted with Victoria. He told stories about her crushing people in business deals, about the friends she'd alienated, about the family members she'd used and discarded. Then he raised his glass and said, "To Esther and Marcus, may your marriage be everything mine wasn't. Honest, loving, and free of federal investigations." The private investigators, who'd been detained for questioning and released, actually stayed for the reception. One of them approached me with a piece of wedding cake and an apology. He said he'd been in the PI business for 20 years and should have known something was off when Victoria asked him to plant evidence. He offered to testify against her and refund her money to help pay back what she'd stolen. The wedding photographer pulled me aside to show me the shots he'd gotten. The one of Victoria falling into the flowers was artistic, almost Renaissance in its composition. The one of her in handcuffs with the wedding party in the background looked like a magazine cover. He asked if I wanted them deleted, but I told him to keep everything. This was part of our story now, the part where justice was served as an appetizer. Around midnight, after most guests had left, I found out Victoria had been denied bail. The prosecutor considered her a flight risk due to the offshore accounts. She'd spent her wedding night not in the honeymoon suite she'd booked to celebrate my humiliation, but in federal detention. The other inmates, according to James's divorce lawyer who had connections, were very interested to hear about the woman who'd been arrested at her own sister's wedding. Marcus and I left for our honeymoon in Hawaii the next morning. At the airport, the TSA agent recognized me from the viral video. "You're the bride whose sister got arrested," she exclaimed. "Girl, that was the best thing I've ever seen. Your grandmother must be smiling down from heaven." 3 months later, I visited Victoria in federal detention. She'd lost weight, her designer clothes replaced with standard issue gray, her perfectly manicured nails now bare, but her delusion remained intact. She spent the entire visit explaining how this was all a misunderstanding, how I'd conspired against her, how the FBI had it all wrong. When I told her I was pregnant and would name the baby Rose after Grandma if it was a girl, she actually laughed. "You think you've won," she said, "but I'll be out in a few years and I'll rebuild everything. You'll see, I'm the successful sister. I've always been the successful one." I stood to leave and told her the truth she'd never accept. "Victoria, success isn't about money or status or being better than everyone else. It's about love, family, and integrity. Grandma knew that. That's why she trusted me. Not because I manipulated her, but because I loved her. Something you never learned how to do." The trial was swift, with Robert Castellano testifying against Victoria in exchange for a reduced sentence, the embezzlement evidence from James, and the FBI's extensive investigation. The verdict was inevitable. Victoria got 15 years for wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. The judge specifically mentioned her attempt to frame me at my wedding as evidence of her complete lack of remorse. Dad sold his house to help pay back what Victoria had stolen from the business. He moved into our guest room temporarily, which turned into permanently when baby Rose was born. He became the grandfather he'd never gotten to be to us, reading stories, changing diapers, and teaching Rose about the grandmother she'd never meet, but whose strength ran through her veins. James's divorce was finalized quickly, since Victoria couldn't contest it from federal prison. He sent us a wedding gift on our first anniversary, a beautiful photo album with pictures from our wedding, including the arrest, with a note, "Every marriage needs a story. Yours just happens to be a federal case." He remarried 2 years later to a kindergarten teacher who'd never heard of offshore accounts. The family import business thrived once the embezzlement stopped bleeding it dry. I took over Grandma's shares and discovered she'd left detailed notes about the business hidden in her recipe box. One note, dated a month before she died, read, "I know what Victoria is doing. The evidence is in the cloud, folder marked pie recipes. Let her hang herself with her own rope. Protect Esther. She has the strength Victoria never will.